Quick video here on how I install Ruger factory scope rings onto a Ruger M77 rifle. This is a M77 Hawkeye. It's a left-handed version. The rings have a little key here that fits in the slot, and then these very heavy screws that fit in the side of the receiver here. The receiver's cast and machined with those in place. And the real trick when you're doing this is that these rings have quite a bit of play, and so what you need to do is take your time when you mount the scope. You don't want to just tighten these things down and then put the scope on, because they might not be lined up quite right. And since the scope's a precision instrument, you want to make sure that you get everything lined up precisely. Okay, I've got the scope rings off here, top of the scope rings off, and I happen to have this lapping kit with a 1-inch steel bar. I'm not going to lap the rings tonight. Today it seems like a lot of work. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this to line up the scope rings so they're facing, so that they're not canted side to side, so they're both facing the same direction. And that scope tube, when it's on there, will be going straight through. We don't want, like I said, you don't want one of these wiggled one way and one wiggled the other way, and then you clamp down your scope and run into problems. I'm thinking that you could do this with the scope tube in place, just more gently, but since I have the steel rod, I'm going to use the steel rod. So I'm just going to tighten down these screws and we'll go from there. I've taken and turned the rifle around so we can see these screws here. They're very large screws. And everything is kind of loose in there. And what I'm going to do is just slowly tighten things down. And I want to take my time, and the goal is to get these two screws locked down real tight while the rings, like I said, the rings are still pointed the same way. So you can use basically the biggest carpenter's screwdriver you can find to fit in these slots here. Or I'm going to torque these down here in a little bit also, but these are giant steel screws. Torque spec must be enormous. And of course, with a scope in this place or with the steel bar, what you'll need to do is take the tops off and adjust the scope. So it's this step here. All I'm doing is getting these main screws cinched down, and saying this over and over again so that they're lined up. So I'm kind of happy where we are now. I'm going to start really tightening these things down. Okay, so I never got the torque wrench out. I just did the old German good and tight here on these screws. I just tightened them down as hard as I could go. They're giant steel screws in there. You're not going to snap them. And I'll take these tops off. I like to keep the rings oriented in the same direction they were when they came off the bottom of the rings, because I think they're polished and lined up pretty nice. So take the bar out. Like I said, I think that as long as you went nice and easy, you could do that with the scope. But since I had the bar, I used the bar. And we're going to put a Redfield 4-12 on this scope today, on this rifle today. I have a little Redfield 2-7 power on my Ruger Scout rifle that I really like. So I'm hopeful about the Redfield here doing well. So what I'm going to do is just walk through how I put these, how I mount a scope, and then kind of show you what I do from there. So gently tighten down these. These are Torx head screws. The old mounts had flat head screws. That's fine too. The trick with the flat head is you get yourself a hollow ground screwdriver. The carpenter screwdrivers with a profile like that, those don't really work all that great. But if you get yourself a hollow ground screwdriver, those work great on flathead screws. So you see the difference in the profiles. This is a chisel and this is ground, so it's basically these two surfaces are parallel when they get in the screw. But like I said, these are Torx heads, so we don't have to worry about that here. So what I'm going to do is just get the rings on, more or less, so the gap on this side is about equal to the gap on the far side. It's nice and centered up. But I want the scope to be able to see. I've already tightened it down too much. The scope needs to be able to rotate a little bit. You want some. Well, that sounds awful. You want it to rotate some, but not a lot. And then what I do is I take the rifle up and I set it to the minimum and then the maximum magnification, and I work out the eye relief front to back. And I just take the rifle up, pick it up, and I put it on my shoulder. I like my head really far forward, so it's emulating what it'd be like if I was shooting prone. So if you get the rifle scope way back, that's fine if you're sitting upright at a bench, but when you get on the ground and you're shooting prone, then that doesn't work so good. So I usually mount my scopes pretty far forward. We'll see what it looks like. Test that at the minimum and then the maximum. And then at that point, you have left to right or front to back fine. Then you go in and I just eyeball it. Trying to get the crosshairs level. I find that works real well. You know, if you take 5 or 10 minutes doing that, you can do real well. The levels that you can put on things, I've never gotten those to work because it's hard to find a level surface on a gun and on a rifle and on a scope. So I picked the rifle up, put it on my shoulder. I moved the zoom in and out, and I moved the scope up and back until I found a spot where I liked it. And what I'm doing, I'm looking through the lens here, and I'm looking at to see. I want the circle of light that's coming out of the back of that lens. You want that to be optimized for your eye, moving this back and forth. Probably at the maximum. The maximum magnification is the one that's the most delicate. So I got that thing lined up. Now what I'm going to do is go side to side, and then we'll tighten down these rings. There's a couple ways you could try and line up a scope without some sort of instrument. One is you can look through the back of the scope and you can see the reticle there, and you can look down and see the axis of the bore and hopefully get that reticle, that vertical crosshair, lined up with the bore. That's all you really need is you want that vertical crosshair to be passing straight down through the middle of the bore, through the middle of the barrel. So you can kind of do this by looking through the back of the gun and see if you can make that happen. Another way that I usually do is I just throw the gun up on my shoulder and I turn the scope left and right until I get it so it feels good. The human eyeball is a pretty precision instrument, and with a little practice you can get that lined up pretty good, so it works most of the time. And if you decide it's off, you just go on and adjust it and do it again. There's gizmos out there that you put a level, put a level on the scope and you put a level on the action. It's like, well, I don't see a part of my scope that's level. Maybe if I took the cap off there, but just eyeballing it seems to work real well. I mean, we're shooting a bullet at 300 yards. We're not trying to launch a rocket and hit the moon. Okay, so next step is we're going to snug down all these screws. So between the bottom and the top scope ring there's a gap, and what you want when you tighten these scope rings down is you want the gap to be equal size on both sides of these rings. So what you do when you tighten these rings down is you just tighten them down and you go diagonally across. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and you just do that pattern, and you do that on the top and the bottom. You do that on both sides, and just check your work as you're going and make sure things are lined up. And if something gets off, go ahead and back it out. And if one ring's tight, you can work on the other, and none of your adjustments will come loose. Alright, so off camera I fiddled around to make sure that the gap between the bottom and the top rings on both sides was even. You know, back out a little bit on one side and tighten down on the other to get it just right. And now you can use these things if you want, but a while back I went and bought a torque wrench and I've never looked back. So Ruger says you want 20 inch-pounds on these screws. So what I do is I start low. I start at about 10, and I'll go in a star pattern 1, 2, 3, 4, tighten down each one of these, and I'll try and heat each screw 2 or 3 times. And so I barely had them snug down to begin with. You can see there's a lot of movement here. With the little Allen wrench here, I didn't tighten them down much. So now that's at 10, and what I'll do is I'll turn it up to 15, and then I'll turn up to 20, and I'll just repeat that front and back until everything's tightened down. It's also good to pick up the rifle, double check the eye relief, moving the scope forward and back, check the eye relief, and then check the cant for to make sure that the scope is still level. And that's it. So take and make sure tighten these bases down with care, because there's a little bit of wiggle, and you want to get them both lined up just right, so when you lay your scope down, it lays on those rings evenly. And then get your rings on just a little bit, adjust the scope relief, the eye relief, and then the cant to get it level, and then tighten things down. Use a torque wrench if you got it, and make sure the gap is the same on either side. So thanks for watching the video. I've got another video on my channel that shows me mounting lapping a set of Ruger rings on another gun. So I'll put a link to that here, and if you want, you can check that out. It's a little older video.